He's an evil master of disguise. Zartan changes color right before your eyes. Zartan changes color. Where's Zartan? I don't know any Zartan.
Live from the Talking Joe Studios, it's Talking Joe.
G.I. Joe, the very best, America's elite. Eliter than all the rest, trained to have no flaws. Defending liberty across the land, valor oversized. Bring out that big brass band, real heroes verified. Gotta read them all, you must agree. Elitist in history, G.I. Joe, or there could be no end. In a world we must defend, G.I. Joe, gotta read them a courageous crew. Their colors red, white and blue. Mess with them and they'll shoot you. G.I. Joe, gotta read them all. Gotta read them all.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and welcome to Talking Joe, the best, possibly, and longest, possibly, dedicated G.I. Joe comics podcast. If you're new to the show, you can find out all of the details over at the website. The website is talkingjoe.co.uk. Now, today we are continuing our look at the Disavowed era of G.I. Joe with the backup story, The Past Comes Back, from G.I. Joe America's Elite issues 5 and 6, which were published by Devil's Due November and December 2005. For those of you reading along in trade form, this is collected in the 2007 trade paperback Dreadnoks Declassified. Now, without further ado, if you've ever watched his Hub comic promo videos, you'll know him as a master of makeup and disguise, a ventriloquist, a linguist of over 20 languages and dialects, an acrobatic contortionist, and a practitioner of several mystic martial arts. It's a real extreme paranoid schizophrenic. It's Tim Finn.
Wow. Hello, Mark, and hello, listeners.
Hello, Tim. I think that's your longest intro to date. So today we are talking about that backup story focused on Zartan. Last time we spoke about America's Elite, we covered the front bit of the story, so now we're going to talk about that extended backup story. Let's do creative team. Creative team for The Past Comes Back story, Josh Blaylock. He's the head honcho at Devil's Due, returning for some G.I. Joe writing. Art is Stanley Lau and Ray Toe of Imaginary Friends Studio. I think we'll come back to them in a minute. Letters, Steve Seeley and Brian J. Crowley. And edits, Mike O'Sullivan.
We're not going to talk about the covers for these two issues, America's Elite 5 and 6, because as these are backup stories, they don't really get covers, and the covers generally for such comics would correspond to the lead story. However, the actual cover for issue 5 does feature Zartan and Storm Shadow facing off moodily in the swamp, so that image actually does connect to this backup. But since we talked about it in a previous episode, and boy did I talk about it, we're going to just get to a plot breakdown. Mark.
Plot breakdown.
Stalker and Storm Shadow, on orders by General Colton, sneak into the abandoned Dreadnoks base in the Florida Everglades to find a secret thing that Zartan has hidden. Xandar attacks them and is able to shoot Stalker with a poison arrow before capturing them in a pit in the ground. Zartan, Zorana, Zanya, Buzzer, Torch and Ripper arrive at the base to help find that secret item. Gung Ho has rescued the Joes from that trap, and those three Joes tussle with the Dreadnok crew. Zanya is able to retrieve a parcel from Zartan's hideout, but Storm Shadow is able to get hold of it. The story comes to a head with a standoff between Storm Shadow and Zartan. Zartan wants the contents of the case, while Storm Shadow wants the antidote for the poison to save his comrade Stalker. We find out that the case contains a photo of Zartan back when he was young with his brothers and parents when they were family. It was a picture that he took with him when he was a young boy, when he was running away from the orphanage. It is revealed that Zartan uses it as a key to hold on to who he really is. Because he takes on so many personalities, he sometimes loses himself. It helps him understand who he really is. There we go. What struck me trying to write that was they do fit in quite a lot into this story, given there is a backup bonus feature. It does zip along at some pace and cover quite a lot of ground.
Yeah, these two backups are 20, 21 pages, and it's unusual in a lot of comics that a backup story would be as long as the lead story.
Yeah.
And in terms of cover price, these two issues, you are paying for it. But, backup stories in the last 5, 10, 15 years in maybe not so much Image Comics or smaller publishers like Devil's do, but, Marvel, DC, they tend to be 8 pages, 10 pages, and generally not as meaty or satisfying as lead stories. Marvel and DC have been doing a lot of $8 and $10 specials the last couple years, like for an anniversary issue of Amazing Spider-Man, or the 30th anniversary Death of Superman special, or like Marvel Voices or DC Pride. And they try and cram in a lot of writers and artists into these quadruple-sized specials, and I find generally the stories are just too short to really have anything. And I was surprised and impressed by how much happens in these two backups and how satisfying the story is.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, the parallel here is that they've had backup story before. They had a Wraith 3-part backup story where they introduced the character of Wraith, and I believe that those were only 3 pages long, 3 or 5 pages long.
Yeah, they were very
short.
Yeah,
and my expectation going into this was relatively low. I don't remember the details of the story, but I remembered not especially liking it at the time. So went into it, as I say, with relatively low expectations. But rereading it, I enjoyed it quite a lot more than I thought I would, which is, I think, quite often a nice surprise when the only way is up, you're not disappointed.
Yeah, I'm ready to not love a Josh Blaylock scripted Devil's Due G.I. Joe story, because I find Blaylock a fascinating person and creative and business person, but in terms of him writing G.I. Joe stories, a lot of them didn't work for me. This story, and again, it's got plenty of pages to work with, but I feel like it hits a sweet spot in terms of number of characters, number of locations, number of important props. It's not overbooked, overburdened. I think back to Reinstated, the first 4 issues of G.I. Joe by Devil's Due that Blaylock wrote, which had 787 characters across 4 issues, and nanites and satellites and ninjas and 73 locations. And this touches on some heroes, some villains. It checks in just lightly with what is going on. I should say indirectly with what's going on at that moment in the main America's Elite story by Joe Casey, where Colton is in charge, and the Joes, or at least some of them, don't trust Storm Shadow. Blaylock is doing 3 things here. He's setting this in the era of Joe Casey's G.I. Joe. He's picking up on something that he, Blaylock, clearly wanted to get to, which is Zartan and the Dreadnoks and that backstory and status quo. And he's also sort of running around in Larry Hama's playground, because a thread of this is that Stalker and Storm Shadow have a shared history, and they're on this small mission together, and also that Hama did so much sort of mythology or world building for G.I. Joe out of Zartan as an antagonist and the Zartan Storm Shadow relationship. And then there's even this reference, I forget which chapter it's in, chapter 1 or chapter 2, where Stalker says to Storm Shadow, we were in Southeast Asia together. And I thought, oh, right. The LERP group. And here's a story that has both Zanya and Zarana in it, and it doesn't feel like one of them should have dropped out and the other could do both roles.
Yep.
Which is how I felt with these two characters in some previous Devil's Due stories. I didn't quite see what Zanya was bringing that was new. And I understand that she's a cool character for a lot of people, and I have not loved this character. But she's got a great line of dialogue. She and Zarana have a great exchange. I like the story.
Actually, that's a sort of a point about line of dialogue that that previously, when we've been doing the Devil's Due read throughs, we've not necessarily called out a favorite line of dialogue because there hasn't always been one that strikes us. And reading these two issues, there were a few places, I've not made a note of them, but where actually I thought, yeah, that writing, that dialogue actually is pretty snappy. It sort of speaks to the character. It sort of moves the story along in a good way. All of these different things. So I thought the writing, in terms of the balance of how much words there were on a page and the actual dialogue and sort of that ringing true with the characters, I thought that all worked well.
Yeah. I also liked that the Dreadnoks, that Thrasher and Torch and Buzzer and Ripper get to do some stuff. There are some G.I. Joe stories where writers who aren't Larry Hama choose or forget that the vehicles are characters too, and we see what's the big Dreadnok motorcycle called? The three-wheeler with the gun.
The Dreadnok tricycle.
Well, I had it as a kid.
It's just called the Dreadnok cycle.
Dreadnok cycle. Actually, I should say I still have it. It's in a box down the hallway, but I had it as a kid. That shows up. The Devilfish show up for a couple panels. There's a little bit of ninja stuff,
mm-hmm.
and it takes place, in the swamp, so in Zartan's actual backyard. So yeah, I think you made a good point just now that sort of there's a good balance or amount of story and dialogue for how much real estate there is. There have been some Blaylock stories where it feels like a lot's getting crammed in, or a lot's getting crammed in at the end and it's rushed. And there was one panel in this whole two-part story where I thought, too many word balloons. Something that this story does that is different and very different, it has a narrator, which Hama never does. It actually has 3 narrators. Colton and Stalker and Storm Shadow, right? Yes, and they're color-coded. So Colton's is green, a light green. Storm Shadow's is a sort of light bluish gray. And Stalker's is sort of a tan, a reddish tan pink. And that is one way in which I know that this is absolutely not a Larry Hama G.I. Joe story. Hama does not write with narration. He just, will do a caption, like Sierra Gordo or The Pit.
Yeah, it's a good observation. So probably the most striking thing about the story is the look of the story, the sort of the style of the art, and it's very much of its time to some degree, but it's this sort of almost painted computer art. So it's not to say that all of it necessarily has been created on the computer, but certainly the final effect, is a sort of a computerized, not sort of glossy, sheeny, everything glowing with lots of gradients type look, but that a more sort of, watercolory, gouache kind of effect of coloring in a sort of a computerized, painterly style.
Yeah, if you think of Dave Dorman's G.I. Joe concept art or his Star Wars paintings, his textures are very his like skin and clothing and fabric are very smooth and like silky. And if you think of the Hector Greedo explosions on the backs of the first couple years of G.I. Joe packaging, you can see the brush strokes. You can see red blobs of paint, orange blobs of paint, yellow blobs of paint. And when we think of computer coloring in comics, we almost always think of, the sort of, Marvel 2023 or Image 1993, lots of slick gradients. But if you're using a program like Photoshop or Painter, you can use many different kinds of brushes and many different kinds of finger quotes paint. You can, as Mark just said, you can paint digitally so that it looks like watercolor, right? Which is much more translucent. You see sort of layers of like brush strokes atop each other. Artwork can be a lot less tight. And the effect here is, I would say, yes, it looks like watercolor, although of course it's digital. And there are some details and edges which have a sharpness to them, but overall there's a soft quality to everything. If I was to use a photographic term, I would say many things in the story are slightly out of focus. And the other way I would describe it is it looks a little bit like this is the color artwork on a layer underneath the inked black line work, and that top layer was turned off. So when I saw the first page of this, I thought two things simultaneously. I thought, oh, wow, different. And also, oh, not quite there. So, like the first two panels, this owl, that's a good painting of an owl. I can't do that in Photoshop or Painter. I don't even know if Painter still exists as a program. But, then the next panel, Stalker, it sort of looks like he's kicking the owl, or I guess the owl got scared and is sort of taking off as Stalker's coming into view. And Stalker's sort of amount of detail and lack of line work, sort of losing his boot and his other leg and his torso sort of in this like middle dark, then you turn the page and this page looks like it's 80% of the way there. That even with a softer sort of digital painted watercolor style, on the second page of the whole story, the third panel, Storm Shadow's crouching on a tree branch up behind Stalker. And I think, yeah, that's 60% done. I need a little more. And the sort of the rules and the rules for the artist and the expectations for the audience are different once you use a different tool. So if you're using pencil and ink and then you erase the pencils, the whole way that you would draw less detail with ink, it's a whole different standard. You might draw like an outline of Storm Shadow's shape on that branch and then just do a couple like sort of horizontal lines, the way that like Jim Lee or Mark Silvestri sometimes kind of just stops drawing feet as feet get close to the ground. There's the outline, but they don't do any of the details, like Todd McFarlane, like shin and ankle and shoe. He kind of just stops drawing the interior detail of the laces, just the outline and like, done. Or, with ink, if you sort of draw less detail, maybe because comics sort of for almost a century defaulted to ink, if you draw with less detail, it can still register as finished. And I feel like this is not the digital painted equivalent of registering as finished. This one looks like a little rushed or unfinished.
And they play with some slightly different techniques as well. So that sort of CCTV footage that they show of Thresher and Zorana and Road Pig, recorded by an undercover cop, there is sort of like in a slightly different style. They've sort of a little bit more line work, a bit the sort of the fuzziness of a sort of TV recording.
It's got a filter over it with horizontal lines for interlacing, and then the photos.
Yeah, and then they've got like a couple of pages over. It's I think as you say, it's probably Colton looking at photos of the Dreadnoks, and they're in a kind of a sepia color, but with the harder, more traditional comic line work to them. But it doesn't sort of strike you as jumping out as looking out of place. So I think it's quite nicely done.
I want to be a little more specific here with my criticism of the art style. It's not just that the painted art looks a little unfinished to me, because I sort of got into it once I was a few pages in. This is now the visual language of the story, and I turn the page and there's more of it, and the storytelling's pretty clear and the story itself is good. What I'm also seeing though is, particularly with the vehicles, I don't know that in this story in 2005, I don't think Lau is all that proficient. The first panel where we see the devilfish, one of them looks a little smaller than the other. And then, the next page, we see the motorcycles. And later on, when we see the motorcycles, some of the sort of parts of it they're not quite symmetrical, or they're just a little out of perspective, or they're a little inconsistent. And so what I think I see here is a color artist who, maybe not for the first time, but for an early time, is not just coloring someone else's art, but doing all of the art. And so it's a cool first or early step, particularly when you sort of remember who this artist turns into a little later. But like the faces look good, like anatomy's pretty good, but some of the poses during the fights, a little awkward. Some of this equipment and tech, I'm not convinced by.
So is that a good segue? Should we talk about the artist and who he turns into?
Yeah.
So the artist is credited as Stanley Lau, but more commonly known as being Stanley Artgerm Lau these days, who's very famous for particularly variant covers in a kind of, particularly for female characters in a sort of slightly manga influenced, kind of cute, slightly cheesecakey style. So a bit of background: born and bred in Hong Kong, Stanley Lau is an illustrator, designer, concept artist, creative director, and co-founder of Imaginary Friends Studios. So that's the Imaginary Friends credited here. A world-acclaimed digital art studio that produces high-quality artworks for the likes of Capcom, DC Comics, Marvel Comics, and other giants in the entertainment and gaming industry. So called out as specifically a digital art studio, and sort of that will be, I think, the colouring aspect of the credits of Imaginary Friends here. Formerly trained in graphic design and advertising, Stanley's art is imbued with a strong sense of aesthetics and visual fluidity, a blend of Eastern and Western styles. Better known by his handle Artgerm, Stanley's art continues to infect and inspire new generations. So on his website, he says, to date, Stanley's online art gallery on DeviantArt has been viewed for more than 50 million times and has more than 1 million followers on social media. So these days, he is definitely a big deal and very, a very hot artist, and it sort of makes me think as well of Devil's Due's pedigree here of finding young artists breaking in the early 2000s, getting them on their books before they go on to bigger things. So we've had a number of artists on the books that we've talked about before, like Chris Lai, that we were talking about on Arashikage Showdown, and of course Stefano Caselli on America's Elite that we've just been reading recently, amongst many others.
Yeah, this is a good point about Devil's Due finding talent that went on to bigger things. Stanley Artgerm Lau, has done some other G.I. Joe work. He did a New York Comic-Con exclusive cover for IDW issue 218 of The Baroness. And maybe that's all. I think I think in my mind there have been variant covers of G.I. Joe with, Cover Girl the Baroness or Scarlet, where someone is drawing in a style in the last 10 years similar to Art Germ's variant covers. And so I thought there might have been more, but when I read this story, when I read it and was taking notes, I didn't connect Stanley Lau with Stanley Art Germ Lau. And it wasn't until I sat down and looked at my notes and did some Googling that I was reminded, oh, this is the guy. This guy is very, very popular. So Imaginary Friends Studio was founded in 2005. And so, these issues of G.I. Joe, issue 5 is cover dated November 2005, which means it probably came out in September, October 2005. And we've seen IFS, we've seen Imaginary Friends Studio on some previous issues of G.I. Joe, although since we're reading a little out of order, I couldn't say exactly from when, but let's say 2005. And the lead story of this issue, the one that we already talked about in issue 5, is colored by Kendrick Lim of Imaginary Friends Studio. And there are 3 founders of Imaginary Friends Studio: Stanley Lau, Kendrick Lim, and Kai Lim. Maybe if we have Blaylock or an editor again or on a future episode, one of our questions could be, where do you find these guys? Or where do you find this guy? So Imaginary Friends Studios has done a lot of work for DC, Marvel, Image, Top Cow, Hasbro, Sideshow, Capcom, Square Enix, Ubisoft, video games, lots of stuff. So the second chapter of this backup story is credited to Stanley Lau again, and also Ray Toh, that's Toh, of Imaginary Friends Studios. And it looks like Ray Toh is no longer a part of IFS, but has his own studio that in 2013, he founded a studio in Singapore called the Morning Rain Studio. Concept art and illustration for a lot of companies that we don't think of when we're reading comics, like Compaq or Sony Ericsson, but also concept art.
And the coloring style through the 2 issues does look very consistent, at least to my eyes. So I wonder if perhaps the Ray Toh's credits are more on maybe layouts or the pencils that sit behind it, because particularly in that second issue, there are a few bits that maybe look less consistent, and a few bits that look, to my eyes as well, a little bit wonky. So, for example, the page, which is like the biggest confrontation, I guess, between Zartan and Storm Shadow in the second part, where Storm Shadow is knocking the gun out of Zartan's hands, and Zartan's sort of torso and his hands and his body language look a bit weird, as do Storm Shadow's. And again, when Storm Shadow is being kicked in the face at the bottom of that page, his sort of posture just looks a little bit odd. So some of the art, particularly just the figure composition, looks a little bit strange in places.
Yeah, some of the poses and panel layouts in chapter 2 are not great. Many of the faces, like the opening 3 pages with some Dreadnoks and with Gung Ho, look good and even a smidge better than the first chapter. But yeah, there's a lot of inconsistency in this second chapter. And, when Torch fires his flamethrower, that looks like, I don't quite have the words for this, that looks like, sort of real flame from like a 3D program, as opposed to a photo of flame or like drawing 2-dimensional flame in a comic book style. And that's cool, but it's also weird because it's such a different sort of style ethos, and it looks a little out of place. I'm also concerned because Blowtorch sets fire to some trees in his fight with Gung Ho, and no one talks about it for the rest of the story.
Torch.
Just,
That was.
they just,
You said blowtorch.
wait, what did I say?
Blowtorch rather than torch.
Oh, excuse me. Yes. There's a Dreadnok villain named Torch, and he's in the story. And the Joe blowtorch is
I might be able to edit to just get rid of the blow,
Okay.
and then you'll be saved. But they're in a swamp. Can you
Right.
set fire to a swamp?
So. Similarly, the art in the sort of flashbacks where Zartan is the sort of years ago flashback where Zartan, you can't quite tell it's him, but it's him, is assassinating someone, and then he's sitting in a chair in a big room with a red carpet getting complimented and recruited. That art is back to this like 60% tight, 60% finished quality. The lighting, the sense of light is good in terms of light source and shadows and color, but it's missing a level of finish or polish. I thought that Zanya going into this sort of underground room bunker of Zartan's was a really fascinating scene because there are several wordless panels, right? It's a 2-page scene split. It's 1 page and another page, right? So, she's going down these stairs, wordless. She presses a button, just a sound effect. Door opens, wordless. She talks to herself as she sees the whole room. And you see sort of his old armor and a big framed photo of, I guess, him, but I also wondered if it was his dad. A Storm Shadow, cowl, and hood. And then what I think are Zartan's 3 guns, like his gun, but 3 times in glass cases, which I thought was, I thought this location was overdone, but I was okay. It's sort of like if you made a trophy room for yourself, it's like, I'm going to put my bowling trophies under glass. But, this room is also some kind of sanctuary, right? There's the bow, the famous bow, and then and there's some awards or medals, and it's hard to see because it's the size of my fingernail, but the sort of Arashikage family portrait of the 7 or so, like hard master, blind master, soft master. That's above that weird sound effect with the 5 V's, which I think goes. Zanya's looking at it sort of over her shoulder. But I also just sort of wondered, it's like, okay, she pulls the black circular carpet up from the floor to reveal this little sliding cover. And under it is like a black square with buttons on it. So you'd push in a code. And then in the next panel, it says, deet, doot, deet, which I guess is the sound of her pushing buttons. But that sound effect is in the wrong place if she's pushing buttons. But because this is left to right, that sound effect needs to happen before the V sound effect. So there's an art and lettering error here, but I'll let it slide. And I think the V is for that little sort of square under the 3rd gun. I think something else is sliding out of the way in the low wall.
Right.
And that's a safe, but I feel like there's a panel missing where now she needs to be closer to the safe. And I thought, cool. Also, this is overly complicated. Like, okay, under the rug, there's a door, and then there are buttons. And then over on the other wall, there's another door with a safe. And we never see her open the safe or pull anything out of the safe. In the next scene, she is just getting on the swamp fire with a little briefcase.
Yeah, it would make more sense maybe if they just sort of simplified that and it was a safe underneath the rug and she gets the case out.
So this scene gets the Josh Blaylock Devils Do Too Much Going On award for this Josh Blaylock story. This gets the reinstated Too Much Happening in 4 Issues story award.
Okay, very good. Let's talk Gung Ho. So he's returned to the story. He's not part of the main America's super elitist team of just a few people. He's been, put on the benches as a non G.I. Joe person now, and he's sort of holding a torch for them. And what I quite like is that there's this kind of link between this backup story and having Gung Ho back, and them putting in a Data Desk profile in there in the comic, and using that profile to kind of link back to the story as well, and sort of add some extra layers there. And it's sort of talking about kind of his loyalty to G.I. Joe, and sort of, I think, an unwillingness to let it go. So he's been sort of doing some on his own spare time, keeping tabs on Cobra and Co, which I think is how comes he turns up in the Dreadnok compound, that he's been keeping an eye out on what's going on there. So was able to swoop in and help out when Stalker and Storm Shadow found themselves in trouble.
How do you feel about Joe we haven't seen showing up?
It's fine. I think it's a nice use of Gung Ho, and it fits into his milieu. But I guess the implication that he's kind of that unwilling to let go of his G.I. Joe life and move on to doing something else, and to the extent that he's kind of running G.I. Joe missions in his spare time, seems like potentially a little bit of a step too far. Another step too far. Xandar versus Storm Shadow. Storm Shadow swoops in to save Stalker, and he slices Xandar's weapon into 1,000,000 bits rather than Xandar into 1,000,000 bits, which maybe would have been more productive. And somehow Xandar is able to take down both Storm Shadow and Stalker, which I thought Xandar a little bit OP there. I think Storm Shadow's on a slightly different level to him.
Yeah, that scene didn't work for me. This is in chapter 1 or chapter 2?
Chapter 1. Towards the end.
Yeah, that scene didn't work for me because Stalker's got his arms crossed above his head to stop Xandar from, smashing him with his weapon. Mm-hmm. And then in this reverse angle, we're now seeing POV what Stalker sees, which is up and above past Xandar, Storm Shadow's flying down and drawing his sword. And then there's that third panel on a page where Storm Shadow is still in midair and doing some fancy sword slashing, and Xandar's head isn't in that panel, and Xandar's weapon isn't in that panel, and Stalker's arms aren't in that panel. So it sort of feels like Storm Shadow is like still 10 feet away. And then the next panel is this reaction shot on Xandar with a good expression where his weapon is sort of popping into bits, having just been sliced and diced. And I guess he's taking a step back in that moment, but I feel like right then Storm Shadow lands right in front of him, if not on him, and then kicks him, right? But no, what happens in the next panel is Xandar is like throwing a grenade at us with his arm outstretched. And again, I don't see Stalker or Storm Shadow within like 1 foot or 2 feet of him. And I think, wait, weren't he and Stalker just grappling? Like they were almost touching. And wouldn't Storm Shadow have landed right there in order to slice his weapon like that? It's like the story is inconsistent because all of a sudden he's actually far enough away that he can throw a grenade, not like drop a grenade at their feet and his feet, but throw a grenade at them. And then the next panel with them sort of coughing with this like smoky haze around, it's like, wait, how is he like 30 feet away now? So that is an art and storytelling and scripting sort of disagreement right there, which took me out of the story. And I'm always willing to give the ninjas in G.I. Joe some extraordinary abilities. Like is it issue 24 of the Marvel run or 32 or something, where Storm Shadow is locked in a seamless cell, and then they go back to it and he's gone. Yeah. Like, how did he get out? It's like, no, they got out because Larry Hama snapped his fingers because he's the writer and he can sort of do whatever he wants. And as long as you can't see the magic trick, you'll believe in the magic, right? It's like, no, he got out because he's a ninja and that ninjas can do anything, right? And if you like cornered Larry Hama and you're like, explain it. It's like, I don't know that there's an explanation, but it's like, I'm 8 and I'm reading a comic, so that's just fun, right? I read that issue later than 8, but that's the idea. Yeah. And this is like, sort of happening
until I need to show it. I don't have to
Right.
figure out the explanation other than he's a ninja and he's good at that stuff.
Yes, and that works for me. My disbelief is suspended. This thing that I see in movies sometimes where at the end of the movie, the hero is really beaten up and they're clearly losing. And then they like take a moment to take a step back and regroup. Sometimes it's like a boxing movie, or sometimes it's a superhero movie.
Or a Hulk Hogan fight.
And then like they remember something that someone said, like their mentor or their wife, or it cuts to like their mentor or their wife sort of across the way, like in the audience yelling like, "You can do it." And then they get this second wind. And I feel like in some movies that is not earned because there is no requisite store of energy that they could call upon. It's like, no, the best this is going to be is a draw. But instead they like come out as if like the previous 10 minutes of punishing fighting hadn't been happening. And they'd like take down the antagonist and they win. And then, the movie's over. And I think, well, that seems inconsistent. It's like the writer just like snapped their fingers and said, oh, instead of like they're down to 10% health, they're back to 60% health, right? And that kind of thing is happening here with this Storm Shadow Xandar thing. And because it's a spatial thing, because I don't buy the actual like kinetics, geography of this fight.
It's a storytelling necessity that they need to be in that pit. And so Xandar needs to make it happen somehow, but there's just a couple of beats that maybe don't quite work.
Right. Okay, yes. Thank you for saying that. So there's a sentence missing there, which is Xandar needs to be a few feet away so he can press the button, and the place that they're all standing, but really Stalker and Storm Shadow are standing, is a trapdoor.
Yeah.
And if you could sell this if you had different panels of right as Storm Shadow lands, having finished his sword slashing, if the camera is aiming down and we see the two of them or the three of them and the ground, and show Xandar like falling back and stumbling away backwards. Like, oh, he's getting away from, he was standing on the trapdoor too. Push the button, they fall.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the two Joes are now locked in this sort of seamless vault, right? That's when I thought, this is like that Hama Storm Shadow thing. Well, I don't know how Blaylock's going to explain that Storm Shadow and Stalker can get out of this, but Storm Shadow, with a snap of a Larry Hama, with a snap of a writer's fingers, Storm Shadow can get out of anything. And this one has a very real world explanation. No, Gung Ho showed up and rescued them. So I like that surprise.
And the surprise of when they open it up and they're gone. This was one of my favorite lines of dialogues, actually, that Zanya says, "You couldn't have poisoned the ninja instead."
Yeah,
I thought that was a good beat to end it on.
One quick thing. There's a nice parallelism or mirroring here where the trapdoor closes, and we see Xandar POV from the Joes, and then you turn the page, and now I can't tell which kid, but it's Xandar or Zartan. I can't tell, or Zorana. I can't tell. Can't tell the three kids apart. I'm sorry.
This is Xandar. This is Xandar coming out of a box, and he was complaining that that his brother hadn't helped him, and they don't know where he is, and he's then away hitching a ride.
So Zorana's the blonde.
Yeah, whatever that hair color is. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a nice parallel where we see a door hatch closing.
Yep.
On Xandar, and then we see a door not opening but having been opened.
Yep.
So that's a nice bit of
transition.
Yes.
Yeah, we were talking about films, and there was a panel in the second part where Gung Ho is fighting Torch, and he sort of leaps up from behind him out of the water, and that reminded me of a film, and I was struggling to think exactly what it was. Is it Rambo?
It's Apocalypse Now.
Okay. He's under the water and he comes out the water from behind someone and grabs them?
Yeah. What's Martin Sheen's character in Apocalypse Now? Captain Willard. yeah, you're looking at the water and it's nighttime and it's lit by, I think, fire, and you just vertically, his head and then his forehead and then his eyes just come up out of the water. And it's also slightly alluded to in Bob Peake's movie poster for Apocalypse Now. But yeah, anytime you see in any movie or comic book someone, particularly a soldier or military person, coming up out of the water like that, that's an allusion to Apocalypse Now. Or if someone hasn't seen that, an allusion to something that's alluding to Apocalypse Now. Coppola's famous Vietnam retelling of Dante's Inferno.
And also, of course, inspired by Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness. I think I'm just looking at the clip. I'm not sure if it was Apocalypse Now that I was thinking of. I think there might be something else. Because I can see Martin Sheen coming out of the water.
Is it First Blood?
I think it's First Blood. I think there might be a part where I don't know. Maybe there's something. Maybe it's something else entirely, or maybe I'm just imagining it. But
I have never seen First Blood.
Oh, you should.
I know. There are movie theaters near my home that screen old movies, not digitally, but on 35 millimeter film, and I that's how I see old movies. I don't watch old movies on TV. I don't rent DVDs. I don't know who rents DVDs. Like I'd never seen Tootsie, and I'd never seen Flatliners, and Tootsie came to this movie theater 3 months ago, and Flatliners was, what was that, last year?
First Blood is quite different to Tootsie.
I when I was in school, the cinematographer to First Blood did come to our auditorium and give a presentation on it and his other movies, and he showed several clips from it, so I know about First Blood.
Listeners, if you know what film I am trying to remember, where someone is in the water and they sort of leap up behind someone with their arms in the air and grab them from behind, please let me know. Is it First Blood I'm thinking of? Is it Predator? Is it something, some big 80s action movie? Anyway, I know it must be something, but not 100% sure.
Okay, so a little nitpick in that security camera footage in the first chapter. Thrasher's hair. When I really need, Thrasher's hair is just all green here, and it's a shorter, spikier haircut. And when I think Thrasher, I think the 1986 figure with more hair that it's black and yellow. And this costume on this guy doesn't look like Thrasher's costume at all. And so I thought, I guess that's one of the other Dreadnoks who, they recruited when they went national. If I'm only going to get to see Thrasher for 3 panels in this whole story, I sure want to know it's Thrasher without him saying, "Old Thrasher will identify himself in the third person by saying his name." I really want to there's Thrasher, not like, oh, he's telling me he's Thrasher. What's happening? Zartan runs away, but is the tree? What does that mean? Let me go to page 13 of chapter 2 and see what I meant. 1, 2, 3. Oh yeah, okay. The page after, Zartan for a moment uses his ability to look like the assassinated Hardmaster. This is page 13 of the second chapter. Zartan's running away from us, from Storm Shadow, and he says in the distance, "Stay there and meditate on it." And there's the letter I with serifs in the middle of a word. Okay, and the next panel, Storm Shadow says, "I can't believe the depths to which you have sunk. I will find you." And this sort of oddly menacing tree branch is in front of him. And then in the third panel, this weird sort of bony brown arm grabs Storm Shadow, and then Storm Shadow is flipping Zartan onto his back. And so I thought, wait, is Zartan the tree?
Yeah.
Did he run away but then come back and jump up in the tree, and then his arm pretended to be a tree branch? Okay, so you just said yeah as if this was like A, obvious, and B, well done. Is this obvious and well done?
Well, I didn't notice it until you pointed it out. But once I noticed it, I was like, yeah, okay, I can see this. So Zartan is either turned into a tree or has camouflaged into a being part of the tree, and is kind of reaching down. He's probably camouflaged himself as a branch of the tree and is reaching down and grabbing.
But he just ran away. He's 15.
He's very quick.
Well, okay.
And Storm Shadow is notoriously slow.
And then, interesting. Another idea, another codename suggestion for that figure was Slow Shadow.
Interesting. When something is both a ninja and interesting.
I think you're writing a jingle. Wow. Okay, so, and then I thought, okay, is Zartan not using chameleon DNA to actually change, but using a hologram projector like Larry Hama has him in the Marvel run, and he's projecting himself running away, but, the hologram thing, well, I guess there's a hologram in front of the door to his underground bunker. Anyway, this scene with him running away, and then he's hiding in the tree, and then Storm Shadow sees through the disguise or the trick and flips him onto his back. Cool idea, doesn't work. The way that it's told doesn't.
Yeah. There's not sufficient reason to kind of explain the gap between Zartan running away and then Storm Shadow losing track of him.
Okay, if you did that on a page turn, if the final panel of a right page is Zartan running away and 15 feet away, and then you turn the page and the first panel on the next page is this same image of looking down past the tree branch as Storm Shadow is sort of sneaking, then you have this sort of embedded like time jump, like, oh, this could be several moments later or an hour later. But the immediacy of one panel to the next, I think it's too much of a leap. And again, in terms of the sort of how the two artists of this story are placing, choreographing, and keeping track of characters in space, right? The final two panels of this same page, Storm Shadow is standing over Zartan because he has his sword at Zartan's face. And then Storm Shadow gets whacked on the back with something, looks like a metal rod. And he says, N-N-N-G-H. And then in the final panel, Zanya is like 15 feet away on the swamp fire.
Or even swamp skier.
Holding the briefcase. And she's sort of driving parallel away from Storm Shadow, not like in the distance into like a vanishing point in the middle of the panel. And she says, I've wanted to do that for a long time. Dad, get on. And I'm thinking, what did she hit him with? Mm. Is she... Well, one of her hands is holding a briefcase, and their hand has the handlebar. So did she have a pipe and she dropped it? Or in that panel where he's getting whacked is sort of the brownish on the right side of the panel, is that actually the briefcase? Why does the briefcase have like a lead pipe shaped trim to it? So, this, I'm sure for some of our listeners, this is a lot of nitpicking, and they're much more interested in sort of the emotional quality of the scene, that Storm Shadow and Zartan have this history that, Storm Shadow has been a Cobra and now he's a Joe again, and Zartan is losing himself, and, revenge. And then, Zanya saves him, and that's cool. And those things are all neat to me. But, twice on this page, I get distracted by like a spatial or storytelling lack of clarity. And so, it's sort of like if I'm in a movie theater and I'm really into a scene and the person next to me is like starts talking really loudly, so my attention is split between trying to listen to what they're saying, trying to ignore what they're saying and get back to the movie, and just being in the movie.
Okay, so I guess a key part of this story is sort of like building out Zartan's backstory and these family dynamics, and this whole idea of him being on medication and his sort of mental health issues about the fact that he keeps on sort of changing his identity, perhaps for prolonged periods of time, and struggling to grasp onto who he really is. What do you make of all of that, Tim? Do you think it's largely successful?
Yeah, there are two things happening here, and they may be in conflict. One is Blaylock is going full steam into the original Larry Hama Zartan character. And I'm going to hold off on a sentence until we get to the final page. But that Zartan has this mysterious history, and maybe we get to finally learn about it. And Blaylock is allowed to be the guy to tell us this story. So those are two things that are, good or interesting or potentially interesting. And I'm on board with those. And then the other thing that Blaylock is doing here, and this is where the conflict may be, is he presents Zartan as a damaged and sympathetic character. And on the final 2 pages, and then a little earlier where he begs Storm Shadow not to drop the case, right? Don't! Please! Right? You should teach your daughter to hit harder, says Storm Shadow, threatening to drop this valuable briefcase into the swamp. Man, if only he'd gotten a Pelican case. Those things are watertight. That's what I store my fancy electronics in. I know they had those in 2005. And then Zanya's about to shoot Storm Shadow, and Zartan says, "Zanya, stop! Storm Shadow, please listen. I thought we put our differences aside. Don't do this. You have no idea what you hold, right?" And then they make a deal after Storm Shadow opens the case, right, and really violates Zartan's privacy. And because he's begging him to not open the case, much less drop the case, right?
Well, Zartan's done worse to him.
Well, yeah. So I think Blaylock is very well treading on the, how Hama has characters accept and forgive and move on. And this turn here where it's like, going into the mission, we definitely want Storm Shadow to, to hit Zartan in the face, to bash him and to bring him in, or to stop the valuable thing, the biological weapon or the nuclear briefcase, right, that Zartan's going back for. And it turns out to be something A, not dangerous, and B, it's rather humane if he lets Zartan have it. Separate from the deal he makes to Zartan will then toss him the antidote because Stalker's been poisoned, right, which we haven't mentioned up until now. So those things are all good and interesting. On the final, him begging Storm Shadow, and then the final 2 pages where Zartan is, this is not a scientific term, going crazy. He's sitting in a car and he's spilled his pills, his lithium, and the letterer is having fun changing fonts and giving a sort of a ragged, wobbly edge to his word balloons. And then the final page, he's just saying his name over and over and over, trying to remember who he is, looking at this family photo. So the thing that's in conflict is seeing Zartan, this cool, vicious, smart, in control character, utterly reduced to a sympathetic and weak character. And I think from a writing standpoint, it's pretty bold. As a G.I. Joe fan, I don't know if I want to see Zartan, sort of debased like that. So I'll turn it back on you, Mark. How do you feel about the ending?
I think I'm with it almost up until that last panel, and it seems like that one just it's sort of turned up to 11, maybe just a couple of notches too high, and the throbbing vein and the tears coming down his face, and just a teeny tiny too overdone. Perhaps it kind of escalates very sort of quickly in those last pages from something that maybe wasn't quite at that kind of I guess wasn't quite foreshadowed to be quite as extreme as it suddenly just cranks it up to on that last panel.
Right. Now, the sentence that I wanted to loop back to, where I think that it's interesting and fascinating and maybe earned, maybe Blaylock really does get to do this, right? This is from Larry Hama's original Zartan dossier from the back of the package in 1984. This is not the variation after the controversy where this sentence got dropped, but the original dossier ends with psychological profile. Extreme paranoid schizophrenic, grows into various multiple personalities to such an extent that the original personality becomes buried and forgotten. As far as I can remember, Hama's never carried that in his stories. You know, he has Zartan going to Japan and sort of begging the sword master to take him in.
Yep.
And he has Zartan on this, mission from Cobra Commander to infiltrate the Arashikage, and Zartan kills Serpentor. That's pretty cool. Zartan pretends to be a couple Joes, and he infiltrates the pit, and that, what is it, the cover to 48? 47? Not 47. 40, the one I was talking about in our previous episode where he's strangling Gung Ho to get into the pit. It's amazing Mike Zeck cover at a Dutch angle. Oh my gosh. It's just 2 heads, an arm, a gun, and a wall. It's one of the best G.I. Joe covers because it's so bold. And Hama has not gone into this. And so Zartan is definitely a favorite of Blaylock. And he's got this sentence from Hama, which had been, forgive the pun, sort of disavowed. With the update of that toy packaging after the controversy about that word, right? The term paranoid schizophrenic.
If I'll expand that a little bit, just because when Zartan he's sort of going through, he sort of changes his alliance and he changes his kind of outlook on the world and his sort of redemptive stance and all these kind of things, and he kills the blind master and then kind of assumes his personality, and sort of, I think in terms of everything that we've seen from Zartan, that's probably the biggest role where he's just sort of immersed himself as being, literally trying to replace the previous person and spend a prolonged period of time as that person, and sort of mentoring, is it Tyrone? And then again in the sort of the IDW era, I think there's been that sort of component of the pulls of his different sides of his psyche in terms of the villain versus the person trying to redeem himself at different occasions.
Yeah, I'll just go back a step with you and agree. I think the writing in this final scene is powerful, but the final scene is turned up so much. I think I don't know if Zartan can come back from that, in these stories. Like the next time Zartan shows up and he's being cool and calm and collected, I'll think, well, he was crying in the car. And I want to be kind to people in mental distress, but also this is a cool villain who I love and love to hate. And it's different than if Cobra Commander might be, captured and he begs to get away or he begs for nice treatment, because I feel like that's part of his character. He's trying to talk his way out. And I might be leaning more into the TV show here than the comic, because I know that Hama has a very different take on the character than they did on the cartoon. But in my mind, they very much cross over. I'm not supposed to hear Chris Latta, the voice actor, when I read the comic, but I do.
Yeah.
And when I started reading the story, I thought, oh, right, Blaylock writes the Dreadnoks Classified miniseries.
Mm-hmm. This is where it's reprinted, yeah.
Yes. And I was like, oh, this is probably not in the Disavowed book with these issues. I wonder if this is in that collection.
I spy with my little eye.
Do you want to go first? Because I suspect you'll probably say one of mine.
Oh, I don't.
You don't have any? Okay, all right.
No, yeah, I don't. No, I don't have them.
I'll do them both then. So I spy Joe Muscarella Jr.
Oh,
winner,
yeah, okay, yeah.
Winner of Diamond Preview's G.I. Joe Open Enlistment Contest on page 19, part 1, hanging out at the bar, and even without that context, looking at that page, it's very clear that person drinking at the bar is a likeness. So it's bound to be somebody.
Yeah. When I got to that page, I thought, who is that? That is definitely someone. So it's like the artist is either putting their friend in or themselves, but it's so in focus and detailed compared to everything else in the panel. Yeah. Either they drew it zoomed in, or they drew it larger and then shrunk it down. And the pose and the perspective mostly work, but it jumps out for those reasons. And in the letters page of this issue, at the beginning of the letters page, the editor explains this. And I have to say, I had... I guess, okay, it's not that I'd forgotten it, it's I hadn't known about it, because it's not a contest that was in an issue of G.I. Joe or a letters page. It was a contest that must have been in Diamond Previews, right? Diamond Previews is the monthly catalog that Diamond Comic Distributors, which is no longer the main, but a main distributor of comics, right? Your comic book store orders comics from Diamond, and then UPS ships those comics from the printer to your store. The contest must have been there.
Yeah.
What's your other I Spy?
My other spy is New Toy.
New toys!
So we've got Dreadnok Torch version 2 from 2005, Valor versus Venom. Included in the Sergeant Bazooka versus Dreadnok Torch 2-pack, which was another contest winner, the winner of the first ever G.I. Joe Fans Choice Poll. So previously, when Torch has appeared in the Devil's Due issues, they've sort of used a kind of updated look of the previous, version 1, just sort of aging him up a bit. And I think this is the first time that this version 2 Torch appears. With like a sort of the roll neck, short-sleeved sweater top thing that he's got.
Is he sort of like Shipwreck's updated costume?
A little bit like that, isn't it? Yeah,
a similar top. Yes, I don't have any I Spies, but I'll just call out that I think I said Swamp Fire several times before when I meant Chameleon. So I'll say Swamp Fire now. So Blaylock fits in 3 different G.I. Joe vehicles from 84 and 86. Oh, 4, right. The Dreadnok cycle. Yeah, anyway. A bunch of old vehicles.
Cool. I did notice one error detected.
Error detected. Error detected. No prize incoming.
It was from the first part where the Dreadnoks are about to stop at that bar. The Dreadnoks are on their Dreadnok cycle. They're driving past a bar called Bottom Shelf, and one of the Dreadnoks says, "Wetting the whistle before we head on. Sounds good to me." And Zartan replies, "Wet it all you want. This is the end of the road for you." And in both instances, wetting and wet is spelt W-H-E-T. So there's a common mistake of the expression to wet one's whistle, spelt W-E-T, and to whet one's appetite, spelt W-H-E-T, because of the identical pronunciation. So since the 14th century, whistle has been a metaphor for the mouth or throat, particularly as an instrument for speaking and singing. So your whistle is the thing with which you, sing, whatever. So to wet one's whistle was an expression to mean to have a drink, stick something wet, liquid, down your old throat hole. Whereas wetting, W-H-E-T-T-I-N-G, refers to the sharpening of an edge of a tool or weapon on a stone. And that was a little bit more common in the medieval times than it is today. So we don't normally get that use of it. but instead it's often used to in conjunction with whetting an appetite, and that means to increase someone's interest and wish for something by giving them a small experience of it. So I've read the Ashcan edition of Transformers from San Diego Comic-Con, and that has whetted my appetite for issue 1 when it comes out. Just being a bit contemporary there, Tim. So there we go. Whetting your whistle versus whetting your appetite.
Very good. Very good. On our next episode, listeners, Mark will very carefully compare In Like Flynn and In Like Flint.
I think that's us done. Is it with the issue? Should we just give it a score and a summary?
Yeah.
Yo, cola, nut, grape, soda.
It's Joey time.
You want to go first?
5, 6. It's a pretty good story, but there's that ending thing. You know, the art is a good start, but not there for me. So I'll say 5, but not a like Devils Do How Dare You. I'm a G.I. Joe fan. 5, but 5.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much in the same boat with you there, Tim. It's it's enjoyable story. I went in prepared to be disappointed by it, and I wasn't. I was actually pleasantly surprised. The art is good in places and sort of almost there in others, and the story, they do an awful lot in not a huge amount of space, and generally it's quite successful. So yeah, I think I'm around about that same level, maybe a 6, just to be a little bit more glass half full. So next time on Talking Joe Disavowed, we'll continue our look at the America's Elite era of G.I. Joe. We'll be picking up with issue 9, and we're also going to be looking at the special missions issues. We're going to try and have some special guests along the way as well, and then we'll also be covering other things here and there. Looking forward to the future in the Skybound era, and looking back to the past and digging out some interesting stuff from G.I. Joe history. So, Tim, where can people find you when you are not talking to me about G.I. Joe comics?
Video essays from my creative partners and I at our YouTube channel, Atomic Abe Productions. My brick and mortar comic book store in Somerville, Massachusetts is Hub Comics. And I write about G.I. Joe at arealamericanbook.com.
Excellent stuff. You can find more about Talking Joe at the usual places. TalkingJoe.co.uk is the website that has links to all of those places. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. We're also on Patreon at patreon.com/TalkingJoe. So a big thanks to all of our backers: Richard, Sam, Jay, Bill, Christopher, Justin, Rob, Brian, and Shane, who are all getting early access to episodes as well as some exclusive content. And that is us done for now. But remember that
Nobody Beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
Laters.